So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about probiotics. And again, probiotics would be those actual live microorganisms that are feeding off of the prebiotics. Now, the definition of a probiotic is a live microorganism, when administered in adequate amounts, will confer a health benefit on the host. And this was actually brought to our attention in the year 2000 by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Health Organization. And they basically worked together so that they could present a report on health and nutritional properties of probiotics and therefore come up with an actual approved, published definition of what a probiotic really is. Now, based on these definitions, the basic criteria to consider in determining whether a microorganism is a probiotic include being, of course, a microbial organism. It has to remain viable and stable during use and storage. It needs to be able to induce a host response as part of that intestinal ecosystem, so part of that microbiota. And of course, it has to be beneficial to the host that's consuming the probiotic. So those are the basic criteria. How do probiotics work? What is their mechanism of action per se? Now, there's two basic areas. There's the non-immunologic and there's the immunologic. So first I'll just talk about from a non-immunologic standpoint, probiotics help to maintain the gut defense barrier, and they actually help to normalize the intestinal permeability and ultimately favorably alter the gut ecosystem. So again, you're just increasing the amount of the good bacteria and making it much more difficult, or providing more competition, if you will, for the potentially pathogenic bacteria to survive and adhere to the mucosa. From an immunologic standpoint, probiotics actually have a role with cytokine secretion. And again, going back to that role of prebiotics, you'll find there's a lot of similarities here. And the reason is that the role of the prebiotics actually feeding the probiotics, and ultimately what we're looking at is increasing the proliferation of the good bacteria. So these good bacteria actually do have a role with the immune system and affecting the various inflammatory mediators. So they may help to rev up those pro-inflammatory cytokines to help infection. For example, trigger those T cells or those B cells, so those various immune cells. And then there's also this related cell-to-cell crosstalk where we have intestinal cells that process certain signals that are given off by bacteria. And this is based on a continuously changing intestinal content. And really what these signals do is influence an overall message through different molecules. So they kind of send a signal to say, oh, I need a pro-inflammatory cytokine, or no, we need to make more or release more of the anti-inflammatory cytokine. So it's a very new area as far as the research and what we have available. And I'm sure we'll see more and more of this interaction between the cells. It's actually as if they're talking to one another. And as technology advances and we can even gain more data to interpret, again, I think we'll see more and more about these particular signals that are being given off by bacteria. And then ultimately, we modify the structure of these potentially harmful antigens so that they don't adhere to the intestinal mucosa and then eventually cause much more damage or harm if they can actually translocate and end up in systemic circulation. Now, bacteria are probably one of the earliest forms of living organisms on the planet. We have bacteria that's present on our skin, in our mucous membranes, our digestive systems. And of course, as I mentioned, some bacteria will contribute to positive health, while others, like E. coli, for example, can be quite detrimental for overall health. And there are basically two types of probiotics that are under the lactic acid bacteria heading. And you've heard me mention them several times already. We have bifidobacteria and we have lactobacillus. And there are several strains and species within each of these types of bacteria. So there's Bifidobacteria lactis, Bifidobacteria longum, infantis. There's several. But just to, bring out a few in case you're reading certain articles, you may see that these types of bacteria certainly are being researched today. And from lactobacillus, I'm sure you're all familiar or can identify the one that's found in yogurt oftentimes, which would be Lactobacillus acidophilus. And then also a more common one is referred to as Lactobacillus GG. And actually, the reason it's called Lactobacillus GG is because back in 1985, the doctors Golden and Gorbach actually researched and discovered this particular species of bacteria. So again, there's other Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Lactobacillus casei. And today you won't necessarily know this, but in several of the yogurts that are available, they don't provide just Lactobacillus acidophilus, but they might include 4 different species within a Lactobacillus family, and they just don't mention it on the label. But you can always contact the manufacturer and ask them how many strains or species they provide in their yogurt, and certainly how much they actually provide or put into the yogurt before it's actually shipped out of the manufacturing plant. That's all that they can actually guarantee. Now, the characteristics of bifidobacteria would include gram-positive rods. So this is going back to microbiology class. They're Y-shaped. Of course, they're naturally present in humans, and they do meet that probiotic criteria. And the characteristics of lactobacillus would be that they're more rod-shaped, but also found naturally in humans and do meet the probiotic criteria. What are some of the potential advantages or benefits from probiotics? Probably one that's the most commonly discussed or you may be aware of is to be used in place of a lactase enzyme. Because these probiotics actually do behave or break down the lactose, individuals that may have lactose intolerance say that they can't handle milk, but they can handle yogurt. So again, probiotics can be used in individual diets where they're trying to avoid lactose because they do have a lactose intolerance. Another area for probiotics, of course, we love to talk about stool and diarrhea, but this is another very common area where probiotics can be very beneficial. And from a prophylactic standpoint, we have Bifidobacteria lactis and Streptococcus thermophilus. And these types of bifidobacteria have been demonstrated by Saavedra et al. To show a decrease in incidence in diarrhea with rotaviral shedding. And of course, the rotavirus can be a very nasty thing in the infant population and these poor little babies that are having extreme diarrhea. And again, we're seeing more and more research showing that by giving probiotics, we can actually decrease this rotaviral shedding, which can minimize the opportunity for one infant to contaminate or pass it along to another infant. So this is one area that's certainly being more and more researched, and it's very promising outcomes. We also look at the role with antibiotic-associated diarrhea and using Lactobacillus GG. And Vanderhoof has shown a decrease of incidence and duration of loose stools. And of course, Clostridium difficile, that nasty bacteria that with the release of the endotoxins definitely triggers a lot of diarrhea. So we're seeing more research with Lactobacillus GG to help with preventing the colonization of C. difficile. And in some studies, there's actually been a reduction or termination of diarrhea in several patients. So many potential advantages for the use of probiotics and their effects with diarrhea. Another area would include modulating the GI tract as far as from an immune standpoint. And again, actually probiotics have been shown to increase IgA production. And IgA is one of those immunoglobulins that helps our bodies fight against foreign bodies, certainly helping to minimize the risk for infection. We've also seen enhanced phagocytic activity and a natural killer cell tumoricidal activity. So in other words, enhancing the opportunity for those macrophages and those other immune cells to eat up and clear away some of those more bad or detrimental bacteria. And then, of course, the positive or beneficial effects on the secretion of various cytokines or those inflammatory mediators.